My granddaughter spilled hot soup on my dress at lunch and laughed like it was a joke. Still, I didn't say a word. I just stared at the stain and remembered the $62,000 tuition fund she took for granted. As the heat sank into my lap, something else settled deeper. Clarity. She thought it was harmless, a mistake, a performance. But while she kept smiling, I quietly made one phone call. Now she's not just short on manners, she's short on a degree. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret sat across from Bethany at the Franklin Street Bistro, the kind of place that was a little too polished for its own good. All exposed brick and polished wood. Chandeliers that seemed more for show than function. It had been Margaret's idea to take her granddaughter out for lunch to celebrate her midterm results, the ones Bethany had claimed were a breeze. The place was busy, the hum of chatter bouncing off the high ceilings, blending with the clink of silverware and the occasional laugh. The food was exquisite, or so the menu promised. Margaret hadn't really paid attention to the dishes. Her eyes had been on Bethany. Bethany, ever the performer, had made sure to be on full display today. Hair flipped just so, a smile that could almost convince you she cared about anyone else. Margaret had tried to see past it, tried to remind herself that this lunch was meant to mark a milestone. Yet, the more she watched Bethany hold court with the waiter, making jokes, flipping her hair, as if it were a stage she were meant to shine on, the more Margaret felt the weight of time pressing in on her chest. The waiter, a young man with a name tag that read Leo, seemed charmed. Bethany laughed too loudly, leaning back in her chair, her fingers running absent-mindedly through her perfectly styled hair. She tossed a teasing glance at Margaret as if to say, "Can you believe how funny I am?" Margaret couldn't decide if she was embarrassed or just resigned. Margaret had already asked for the soup. It wasn't the most exciting choice, but she didn't mind. Comfort food was what she needed today, the sort of thing that didn't require pretense. The waiter placed the bowl down gently in front of her, and Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm porcelain, savoring the simple pleasure. It smelled good. Chicken broth, herbs, the kind of thing that made her feel a little more grounded in a world that was always moving faster than she could follow. Bethany had no such interest in grounding herself. With a flick of her wrist, she reached across the table, the flourish of her hand too dramatic for the space. Her elbow nudged the edge of Margaret's bowl. In a split second, it toppled. Soup splashed across the table, the contents splattering in an arc, and a heavy splash of broth landed directly on Margaret's lap. "Oops!" Bethany's voice was high, almost giddy with amusement as she watched the liquid soak into the fabric. That dress needed retiring anyway. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her lap. The heat of the soup still seeped through the fabric, though it was more the surprise of it that made her breath catch. She dabbed with the napkin, trying to absorb what little of the mess she could, but it was pointless. The damage had been done. Bethany laughed, a carefree, loud sound that seemed entirely out of place in the sterile environment of the restaurant. Margaret didn't look up. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the stain, her hand trembling slightly as she worked to clean it. It wasn't the soup that bothered her. It was the way Bethany acted as though nothing had happened, as if it were a joke she was telling herself more than anyone else. Susan chuckled, her high-pitched laugh filling the space, like it was some shared inside joke. Thomas, across the table, didn't even look up from his phone. His thumb scrolled lazily, eyes focused on whatever world was unfolding behind the glass. He was always somewhere else, in one way or another. Margaret did not respond. She didn't have to. What was there to say? Her silence was a different kind of message. There was no anger, no sharp reprimand. She simply didn't have the energy for it anymore. But in her mind, Margaret opened a file. It was labeled Bethany Education Fund. It was a file that had been built over years, a carefully constructed legacy, one that had funded everything from private tutors to piano lessons, from summer enrichment camps to a new laptop for her freshman year of college. Every penny had been spent with the expectation that it was an investment in Bethany's future. But Margaret had begun to wonder if that investment had lost its value. She dabbed at the last remnants of soup on her lap and placed the napkin down on the table with a deliberate calmness. Bethany, still smiling, hadn't noticed the shift in Margaret's demeanor. She didn't have to. "I'm so glad we're doing this," Bethany said, her voice almost saccharine, too sweet to be sincere. She flicked her hair again, a deliberate motion to send a message. She didn't care that Margaret was inconvenienced. She cared only about the performance. Margaret's lips tightened, but her eyes remained soft, detached. "Well, I'm glad you think so." Her voice was even, low, the kind of tone that might have been too difficult to read if one wasn't paying attention. And in that quiet space, something shifted. The conversation moved on. Susan talked about some charity event she'd attended. Thomas clicked through his phone, and Bethany resumed her charm offensive with Leo the waiter. But in Margaret's mind, that file opened wide, its contents reviewed once more. The numbers, the years of steady deposits, the expectations, the realizations. Margaret did not feel the need to respond to Bethany. The conversation was already over, though it had yet to be said aloud. What Margaret would do next was something that would be felt more than heard. The lunch might have been a celebration, but for Margaret, it was the quiet beginning of an end. Margaret sat alone in her sunlit corner of Everwood Retirement Villas, a cup of chamomile tea cooling beside her, the quiet hum of the building's air conditioning the only sound in the room. She had left the lunch behind her, but the echoes of it clung to her like the soup on her dress. In the solitude of her apartment, the weight of her decision began to settle, creeping slowly into her bones, yet something about it felt oddly freeing. She glanced at the clock. Time to make the call. Victor Reese, her estate attorney, answered on the second ring. His voice was measured, precise, like a man who had lived his entire life in the pursuit of clarity. "Margaret," he said, the familiarity of their years of working together settling in. "What can I do for you today?" "I need to freeze Bethany's educational fund," she said, her voice unwavering. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that suggested Victor had already anticipated this moment. His response came, sharp and efficient as always. "Understood. You're the sole controller, so the decision is entirely yours." He paused again. "Shall we notify them?" Margaret looked out the window, watching the trees bend slightly in the wind, as though the world itself were waiting for her response. She inhaled deeply, feeling a rare calm. She was no longer confused about what she had to do. "No," she said quietly. "Let them feel the chill first." Victor didn't ask any further questions. It wasn't his job to ask. Instead, he confirmed the action and promised to take care of the details. The conversation ended with a simple, "I'll get on it immediately." Margaret placed the phone down, but the silence it left behind was heavy, thick with unresolved tension. She picked up her tea, the warmth of the cup grounding her as her thoughts drifted to another time, another place. It was a memory of Bethany as a little girl, back when the world seemed much simpler. Margaret could almost smell the flour on the countertops, feel the warmth of the oven as she and Bethany baked cookies in the kitchen of the house on Belmont Drive. It had been a Saturday morning, the air outside crisp with the early autumn chill. The little girl, barely 10, had stood on a stool, her small hands helping Margaret roll the dough, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Grandma, what's this word?" Bethany had asked, pointing to a recipe card. Margaret had smiled, wiped flour from her own cheek, and leaned in close. "Preheat," she'd said gently. "It means to heat the oven before you put something inside." Bethany had repeated it slowly, testing out the new word as if it was the key to some unspoken treasure. You mean like when I have to practice before my spelling test? Margaret had laughed, the sound bright and light. Exactly like that. Bethany's eyes had lit up with excitement, the kind that only children could truly possess. I love practicing, she'd said, smiling up at Margaret, as though every little effort would make her an expert on everything. And Margaret had believed it. Believed in that earnest, eager child who had so much promise in her eyes. The thought made her heart ache now. The little girl who had once helped her bake cookies, learning to spell, learning to live. She had grown into someone unrecognizable, someone who'd laugh at a mess, a disruption, as if it were nothing more than a game. The girl who once practiced diligently had become the young woman who now took everything for granted. Margaret set the tea down on the side table, the image of that girl blurring in her mind's eye. Sometimes they grow into someone you wouldn't lend money to. Joanne's voice interrupted her thoughts, as if her best friend had been standing right next to her. Margaret could almost see Joanne's sharp, knowing look, the way she would say those words, quiet but loaded. Like they had been said 100 times before, to people who could never quite hear the truth. Margaret had never forgotten that advice. Maybe she should have. Maybe she shouldn't have let herself get caught in the idea that all the years of nurturing and support would result in anything other than a debt of entitlement. Bethany had stopped needing her, it seemed, or perhaps Margaret had stopped being someone Bethany could look up to. She had always tried to be the guiding hand. But now, after the lunch, after the spilled soup and the laughter, Margaret realized that her role in Bethany's life had always been transactional. She wasn't the grandmother anymore. She was the checkbook. As Margaret thought back to the frozen moment in the bistro, her mind flickered back to the file in her head. The one labeled Bethany Education Fund. She could feel the weight of the decision settle more deeply, the truth becoming clearer. She had built that fund with the hope that Bethany would be someone who appreciated it, someone who would give it purpose. But now it felt like the last of the warmth was fading from the investment, leaving only the cold emptiness of being taken for granted. Margaret looked down at her hands, the lines of age drawn deep into her skin. She thought of all the years of effort she had put into building something that was supposed to secure her family's future. How had it all come to this? The fund was frozen now. The notifications would come, eventually, but Margaret was no longer concerned with the noise. She was done trying to be understood. For the first time in a long while, she felt a quiet peace. Margaret sat in the soft, cushioned armchair by her window, her fingers resting on the edge of her phone. The screen glowed in the dim light of her apartment, a silent reminder of the world outside, the world she'd walked away from. Or rather, the world that had walked away from her. Bethany's message had been waiting for her when she returned from lunch, tucked neatly into the corner of her phone, a simple text that she knew was meant to evoke some sort of guilt. Grandma, I just wanted to say thank you for the lunch today. I hope you're okay. Bethany. It was polite enough, but something about it, the forced kindness wrapped in self-interest, made Margaret's stomach twist. She stared at it for a long time, the words swimming before her eyes. Her thumb hovered over the screen, and for a moment, she considered responding. Just a short message, something to acknowledge the effort, maybe. But the thought evaporated quickly. No, there was nothing to say. Instead, she swiped the message away, her thumb gliding effortlessly across the screen, and deleted it. There would be no reply. She put the phone down and stood, the cool air of Everwood's hallways brushing against her skin as she walked out to the garden. The soft clink of wind chimes sounded in the distance, a reminder that time here moved in its own way, slowly, peacefully, uninterrupted by the noise of the outside world. The garden was peaceful, full of vibrant flowers that bloomed year-round in a display of color Margaret had come to appreciate. But what caught her eye now wasn't the flowers or the benches scattered throughout the garden. It was the birds at the feeder, darting in and out. quick little creatures, unhurried and free. She stood there for a while, watching them, letting the quiet of the space surround her. The cold stone of the garden path felt solid beneath her shoes. Here, there was no room for pretense, no room for expectations. Just the simple movement of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. The world here didn't require her to perform. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, dragging her back into the present. She didn't need to check it, but the curiosity was like a pull she couldn't ignore. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the screen again. It was another text, this time from Susan. Just checking in. Bethany's counting on that final semester deposit. Please let me know if you need anything. Margaret stared at the message. There it was. The subtle pressure. The implication that she should be doing something. The silent, calculated request wrapped in concern. How many times had she seen these messages from Susan, always looking for a way to make her feel like the next step was her responsibility? The unspoken understanding that Bethany's future was a weight Margaret alone had to bear. Margaret felt the heat rise in her chest but exhaled slowly, letting the frustration pass. She didn't need to reply. She didn't owe them anything. Bethany wasn't the only one with expectations. Margaret had spent years keeping those expectations afloat, quietly carrying them, making sure everyone stayed comfortable, whether it was with their image or their financial stability. But today, she realized that the comfort she'd been maintaining had been a slow erosion of her own peace. Victor Reese's voice echoed in her mind from their earlier conversation. No notification necessary. Let them feel the chill. That was all there was to it now. The text messages, the expectations, the relentless push of the family. It all felt so distant now. Margaret didn't need to meet those demands anymore. Not today. Not ever again. Margaret walked slowly back toward her apartment, her thoughts quiet as the soft sounds of Everwood's life continued around her. As she entered her room, she found Joanne waiting for her, sitting at the small table by the window, 2 cups of tea in hand. Joanne smiled as Margaret walked in, her eyes filled with knowing. "You still cleaning soup out of that dress?" she asked softly, her tone light but weighted with the unspoken understanding of everything Margaret hadn't yet said aloud. Margaret's lips quirked upward, just slightly. "No," she replied, her voice steady and calm, the silence between them stretching comfortably. "But I'm cleaning names off my legacy." Joanne didn't say anything at first, her gaze steady, as though taking in the full weight of Margaret's words. Then, with a soft nod, she raised her teacup to her lips and sipped. It was the kind of moment that didn't need more words. Margaret sat beside her, letting the warmth of the tea settle in her hands, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed distant, fading into the soft hum of the life she'd built. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt the deep, quiet certainty of her own choices. No more guilt, no more obligations, just a legacy she was reshaping, and a future where she would no longer be invisible. The quiet was thick with meaning, but Margaret didn't mind. It was her peace now, and it was hers to keep. Margaret's apartment was quiet when the doorbell rang. The soft echo of it bounced off the walls of her small, neat space, almost startling in its suddenness. Margaret stood slowly, the weight of her decision settling deep into her bones, and walked to the door. She opened it with the careful precision that had become second nature to her. Bethany stood in the hallway, a forced smile stretching across her face, an attempt at humility that was as thin as the paper-thin veneer of a carefully crafted image. She was wearing a black cardigan over a dress that was just slightly too fancy for the occasion, a feigned effort to appear casual. "Grandma," she said, her voice carrying the feigned sweetness of someone trying too hard to show concern. "Is everything okay?" Margaret stood still, her expression unreadable. She could see the tension in Bethany's posture, the way her eyes darted over the room, as if measuring the distance between herself and the consequences that had already begun to settle. Margaret didn't move, didn't invite her in. Not yet. Bethany shifted her weight, her smile faltering for a moment. "You didn't answer my text," she added, the edges of her voice softening just a bit, as though she thought that might make a difference. Margaret didn't respond immediately. She simply stepped aside, allowing Bethany to enter. The silence that followed was more telling than any words could have been. Margaret watched as Bethany stepped into the well-lit living room, her eyes flicking around, noting the immaculately arranged space. There was a brief flicker of something, resentment, that passed over Bethany's face, quickly masked by her practiced smile. "Please sit," Margaret said, gesturing to the chair by the window. She didn't invite her to the couch, not today. There was a distance she was beginning to draw, both physically and emotionally, that Bethany would have to adjust to. Bethany sat down, smoothing the front of her cardigan as she did. There was a brief moment of awkwardness where neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that magnified the growing distance between them, a silence filled with too many unsaid things. Margaret sat across from her, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and allowed the quiet to linger for a few beats longer. She could see the way Bethany was waiting for something, some sign, some hint of softness, perhaps even an apology, but Margaret didn't intend to give her any of that. Finally, Margaret reached for a stack of papers resting on the table beside her. She slid them forward toward Bethany, her movements slow, deliberate. The top page was the one that would matter. Bethany glanced at it, and then back at Margaret, a furrow forming between her brows. "What's this?" she asked, her tone slightly defensive, though she had to know. "A ledger," Margaret said simply. "A record of 12 years of uninterrupted tuition payments. Everything you've received. Every penny that's gone into your education." Bethany's eyes flicked from the paper to Margaret's face, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. I don't understand. Why are you showing me this?" Margaret's gaze didn't waver. "Because today, the payments stop. It paused the day you laughed." Bethany blinked, the flicker of surprise that crossed her face quickly replaced with confusion, and then something sharper. Annoyance. "What do you mean, paused? Grandma, I don't get it. It was just a joke, all right? Just a mistake." Margaret leaned forward slightly, the calm in her voice unshakable. "Then this is just an adjustment." Bethany's face flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and outrage rising within her. Her breath quickened, her hands clenched around the edges of the chair, the power she thought she had slipping from her grasp. "You're really doing this?" Her voice cracked, but she quickly regained control. "I can't believe you're doing this." Margaret remained still, her eyes steady, never leaving Bethany's. There was no rush, no need for anything more than the calm, steady pace of inevitability. "I've done this," Margaret replied softly. "I've spent 12 years investing in your future. But that future," she added, her voice just above a whisper, "stopped being mine to control the moment you decided your actions were worth more than respect." Bethany stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She looked down at the papers Margaret had laid before her, and then back at Margaret, eyes flashing with something darker. "I can't believe this," she spat. "You're taking away my future over a stupid mistake?" Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't even look away. "You'll find another way?" Margaret said, her voice firm but not cruel. "You always have." Bethany's breath came in short, sharp bursts, her face a mask of barely contained fury. She stepped back, her body language making it clear that she was done. "Fine," she hissed, her voice low. "I'll figure it out. But you won't get away with this." She turned toward the door without another word, and Margaret stayed seated, her eyes following her granddaughter's exit. The slam of the door echoed in the quiet apartment, and for a long moment, Margaret didn't move. She simply sat there, in the silence, her eyes closed, savoring the weight of the moment. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the first step had been taken, and it was hers to command. The morning light in Margaret's apartment was soft, almost apologetic. It filtered through the blinds in pale streaks, tracing lines across the wooden floors. Margaret sat at her small desk, her fingers poised over the keyboard of her laptop, a decision in front of her. It had been made, long before she'd even opened the device, but the finality of it, the way it would ripple outward, still caught in her chest. Victor's email was open, the subject line reading, "Transfer Request, Bethany Carter Education Fund." The remaining balance, $62,000, sat there like a weight. But it wasn't the money that held her attention. It was what that sum could become now that she had taken it from the person who would never understand its worth. She hadn't looked at the email in days. After the confrontation, after Bethany stormed out of Everwood, the distance between them had never felt more complete. The text messages, the demands, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered now was what she would do with the legacy she had carefully built for so many years. Margaret took a deep breath, her gaze lingering on the cursor blinking steadily on the screen. Her fingers tapped the keys with purpose, typing the brief instructions. Transfer funds to Ridgeway Opportunity Grant. New beneficiary, Rosa Ellis, 4.0 student at UNC, aged out of foster care. Immediate processing, no exceptions. Her hand hovered over the send button for a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't doubt that stopped her, but a strange sense of peace. A sense that this was finally the right thing. She clicked send. Victor's confirmation pinged almost immediately. Funds transferred. Await quarterly impact statements for new beneficiary. Further instructions will follow. Margaret read the email once, then again. The weight in her chest slowly began to lift. She wasn't worried about Rosa. This was a gift, not a burden. Rosa deserved this. Margaret had known that from the moment she'd first read her story, from the moment she'd seen the 4.0 and understood the depth of it. A young woman who had survived the system, who had pushed through every obstacle placed in front of her, who had done everything right. Rosa was the kind of person Margaret wanted to invest in. She was someone who knew the value of perseverance. The old ledger, the one filled with tuition payments for Bethany, was still open on her desk, its pages marked with the bright red ink of her decision. She felt a moment of nostalgia, but it was fleeting. She was done with nostalgia. The future wasn't in the past. It never had been. Margaret closed her laptop with a soft click and stood, moving toward the living room. Joanne was sitting on the couch, as she always did when she visited. She had brought a tray with 2 glasses of lemonade, the condensation already gathering on the outside of the glasses in the summer heat. "You look like someone who's just made a decision," Joanne said, her voice light, teasing even. Margaret didn't answer right away. She simply picked up a glass and took a sip, feeling the tartness of the lemonade cut through the air. It was refreshing, grounding, like the weight of the last few weeks had just slipped away with the cold sweetness. "I did," Margaret replied after a pause. She let her eyes meet Joanne's, steady and sure. "It's done." Joanne didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. The moment they'd shared in silence spoke volumes. Instead, she raised her glass to Margaret with a quiet smile. "Well," she said, her tone shifting to something more approving, "you've still got the steadiest hand in the family." Margaret smiled, a small, private smile. It wasn't an easy decision. It hadn't been about the money. Not really. It had been about the belief. The belief that real value isn't measured in dollars, but in the depth of what someone does with what they're given. "I did what was right," Margaret said softly. Joanne leaned back, eyes studying Margaret with a quiet respect. She didn't push, didn't probe. It wasn't necessary. Margaret could feel the support, feel the understanding that had existed between them for decades. Margaret walked over to the small shelf where her will was kept, a few legal documents, a faded photo album from a time long ago. She took the will in her hands, opened it to the section that had once been earmarked for Bethany. A few precise strokes of her pen, and Bethany's name was gone. Not erased. No, nothing so messy. It was simply no longer there, replaced by the words, Ridgeway Opportunity Grant. There was no bitterness in the movement. No anger. Just a quiet, deliberate redirection. That evening, Margaret sat on the porch, watching the sun dip lower, casting long shadows over the garden. The world outside was calm, the kind of stillness that had always drawn her, that had always made her feel like she belonged to it in some way. The world was still there, and now, for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe again. She thought of Rosa, of her quiet strength, of how she would look at the impact statement, how she might feel knowing someone who had never met her, had invested in her future, believing in her when no one else had. Margaret allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Gratitude, she thought. Now, that's a legacy worth having. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. She glanced at it without much urgency. It was an email from Victor. The final will has been updated. Your changes have been processed. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the finality of it, the weight of it settling into her chest, lighter now than it had ever been. She wasn't looking back anymore. The future, her future, was a blank page, waiting for her to write it. The silence in Margaret's apartment was a balm. She had found solace in it over the years, the hum of the air conditioner, the sound of her own steady breathing. And now, more than ever, it was a sanctuary. She sat by the window, the last remnants of the afternoon light fading, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The world outside her walls was moving on without her, but inside, Margaret felt more at peace than she had in a long time. Her phone buzzed, jarring her from the stillness. It was an email from Susan, titled, Urgent, Bethany's transcript issue. Margaret's eyes flicked over the words quickly, the tone a mix of concern and barely veiled demand. I've just heard back from the registrar's office. Bethany's final semester transcript release is being held due to an issue with her funding. This is affecting her ability to graduate. I don't know what you're doing, but this is causing her a great deal of stress. Please, we need to resolve this immediately. Margaret read the email twice, but her expression didn't change. The sense of urgency Susan tried to create fell flat. This wasn't her problem. The problem had already been solved, in a way Susan would never understand. With a steady hand, Margaret tapped out a brief reply. She attached the email to a new one, forwarded it to Victor Reese without comment. No reply necessary. It was a simple instruction, but it carried weight. The finality of it. The way the world outside would have to adjust. Margaret set her phone down, the glow of the screen fading to black. The phone rang again almost immediately after. This time, it was Thomas. Mom, can we just talk? His voice was tentative, soft, like he wasn't sure how to begin. But Margaret could hear the edge of frustration beneath it. She didn't flinch. She knew the drill. The soft-spoken requests. The attempts to bridge the divide without ever acknowledging what had happened. She'd been through this cycle enough times to know that this conversation was more about him than about anything she had done. We just did, Margaret replied simply, her voice calm and controlled. There was a long pause on the other end. Thomas wasn't ready for that answer. Mom, please. But Margaret interrupted, her tone remaining even, unshaken. This isn't a conversation, Thomas. You know what's been done. You know what I've decided. She heard the sharp exhale of his breath, the soft click of a sigh, and then, nothing. "I'll talk to you later," he muttered before hanging up. Margaret set the phone down without a second thought. No emotion swelled within her. The conversation had ended the moment it started. She could almost hear the wheels turning in Thomas's mind, the effort to reconcile what was happening with his own need to keep the peace. But peace had come at a cost, and Margaret wasn't willing to pay it anymore. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her favorite chair, the one by the window where the streetlights began to flicker on in the distance. Her tea was long gone, and the house had grown colder, the quiet thick around her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an email. It was a post from Bethany, one of those online diatribes people launch when they feel the world has wronged them. The message was short, snide, and aimed directly at Margaret. "When the people you count on turn petty, all the years of support and care, and now it's clear. They never had your back." The words burned, but not the way they used to. She wasn't angry, not anymore. More than anything, she was sad. Sad that Bethany couldn't see what had been given, what had been taken, and what she had lost in her own actions. The notifications rolled in beneath the post. Comments, reactions, likes. People chiming in with varying degrees of support and condemnation. Some echoed Bethany's words. Others questioned the situation, but most were just distant observers, unaware of the real story. A few distant relatives sent private messages, concerned and disapproving. But Margaret ignored them all, letting the buzz of the digital world fade into white noise. She was done with explanations, done with the need to defend herself. Joanne's voice broke the silence, light and knowing, as she entered the room, holding a glass of lemonade. She didn't need to ask what had happened. It was all in the air, unsaid but understood. "They're loud because they're losing control," Joanne said softly, sitting beside her. Margaret glanced at her, the faintest of smiles touching her lips. "Let them shout," she replied quietly. "It's the only way they know how to be heard." Joanne raised her glass in a silent toast, her eyes meeting Margaret's. The moment passed between them without the need for words. Margaret allowed herself a small sigh. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't fighting for control. She wasn't scrambling to make others understand. She had made her decision, and nothing, no text, no post, no phone call, would change it. The world outside would continue its chaotic spin, but inside her apartment, in this moment, Margaret had found her peace, and it was enough. The air in the auditorium was thick with anticipation, the kind of energy that clung to every corner of the room, bouncing off the polished floors and the high, vaulted ceiling. The room buzzed with the chatter of students, their excitement palpable, the culmination of years of late nights, early mornings, and endless assignments finally coming to a head. It was supposed to be a day of celebration, of recognition, but for Bethany, it felt more like an obstacle course, each step forward more tenuous than the last. Margaret sat near the back, the plush seats of the auditorium sinking slightly beneath her weight. She had arrived early, as she always did, preferring to watch events unfold from a distance. She wasn't there to partake in the festivities. Not really. She was only there because Bethany had asked her to attend. It had taken a lot of effort on Bethany's part, a rare show of humility that only made Margaret more resolute in her decision. Bethany stood near the front of the room, looking every bit the confident, poised young woman she had worked so hard to become, or at least, that's how it appeared. Her blonde hair cascaded in soft waves down her back, her cap tilted at an angle that made her look as though she had just stepped out of a magazine spread. Her face was carefully composed, the picture of grace and success. But Margaret could see the tension behind those eyes, the way her shoulders were held too stiffly, the slight flicker of discomfort when someone brushed too close. It was a practiced mask, one that Bethany had perfected over the years. But today, that mask was starting to crack. Margaret could feel it, the cracks widening with each passing second. The rehearsal began in earnest, students lining up in their places, everyone moving with a purpose. Bethany shuffled forward, keeping her head high, her movements almost mechanical as she made her way toward the front of the line. She was just a few steps away from the bursar's table when the attendant, a young woman with dark glasses, raised her hand to stop her. "Bethany Carter?" the attendant called, scanning a list on her clipboard. "Could you step aside for a moment?" Bethany hesitated, a slight furrow appearing on her brow, but she did as instructed, walking over to the side of the stage with a practiced air of composure. Margaret's gaze followed her every move, noting the subtle shift in her granddaughter's body language. The confidence was beginning to unravel. The attendant spoke quietly to Bethany, her lips barely moving. Margaret could see the slight nod from Bethany, the words lost in the noise of the rehearsal, but the change in Bethany's posture was unmistakable, the sharp intake of breath, the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. A moment later, the attendant turned away, speaking to another staff member. Margaret saw the subtle shake of Bethany's shoulders as she tried to regain control, but it was no use. Margaret could almost hear the words in her granddaughter's mind. "It can't be happening. Not today. Not here." The student attendant came back over, her tone polite but firm. "Unfortunately, Bethany, we won't be able to release your cap and gown today. There seems to be an issue with your account. You'll need to clear that up before we can proceed." Bethany's face blanched, the mask slipping completely now, revealing the rawness beneath. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. She turned away quickly, taking several steps toward the back of the room before stopping, as if trying to collect herself. The room's noise seemed to wash over her, but all Margaret could hear was the brittle silence that had settled between them. A few murmurs from the other students, whispers that carried on the air. And then Bethany snapped, her voice louder than necessary. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. But it didn't stay under for long. "Why is this even happening now?" She turned to face the staff, her voice climbing in volume. "I've worked for this. I've done everything I was supposed to do. Why is this happening?" The commotion caught the attention of a few students, a ripple running through the crowd. Margaret could see the telltale signs of Bethany's carefully constructed world crumbling, the facade cracking beneath the pressure. The staff member, clearly unfazed, spoke again. "You'll need to speak with the bursar's office. I'm sorry, but we can't release your gown without resolving the issue." Bethany's hands were shaking now, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She looked like a child, angry, helpless, and undone. The coldness in Margaret's chest grew. This wasn't about the gown, not anymore. It wasn't even about the graduation. It was about something deeper, something Margaret had known would eventually surface. Bethany turned and stormed away, her steps heavy with the weight of everything falling apart. Margaret stood still, watching her retreat into the hallway, the last bit of pride slipping away with each step. She could hear Bethany's voice crackling from across the room. "This is so unfair!" As she watched her granddaughter disappear, Margaret's eyes met the gaze of Camille, one of Bethany's classmates, who had been standing nearby. Camille was holding her cap in one hand, watching Bethany with a mix of pity and something else. Amusement, perhaps. Camille's voice was barely a whisper, but it was sharp, cutting through the moment. "Guess all that confidence was borrowed." Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to. The words didn't matter. Bethany was learning a hard lesson today, one that Margaret had been trying to teach her for years. Bethany's cries echoed down the hall as she disappeared, the sharp sound of her frustration cutting through the din of the rehearsal. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over her like a fog. Margaret walked slowly to the back of the auditorium, where the door to the hall opened out into the fresh air. She needed space, a moment of clarity. She stepped outside, the cool breeze sweeping over her face, and made her way toward the nearest bench. She sat down, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Victor, confirming the funds had been redirected. The weight of the past few days lifted slightly, the air around her becoming just a little clearer. Inside the building, the ceremony would go on. But Margaret knew this. Today, for Bethany, the future had already been rewritten, and there was no going back. Margaret took a sip of iced tea from her thermos, watching the sun slowly dip beneath the horizon. Margaret sat at her desk, the same space where the decision had been made, her fingers resting lightly on the papers in front of her. The room was quiet. The only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the passage of time in slow, deliberate increments. She had spent so many years watching the seconds slip by, each one tethering her to a future she thought she understood. But now, the future had changed. It was no longer about Bethany. It was about something new, something more purposeful. Victor Reese's voice broke the silence as he spoke over the phone, his tone businesslike, precise. "It's done," he said, his words falling with the weight of finality. Margaret nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Good," she said, her voice calm. But there was a shift in the air now. Something lighter, almost freeing. She'd signed the papers earlier that morning. Her name, sharp and clean, scrawled across the lines that sealed the end of Bethany's educational fund. "Everything has been closed out," Victor continued, his voice unchanging. "The remaining balance has been redirected to the Ridgeway Opportunity Grant, as per your instructions. All that's left is the final impact statement. I'll send it over when it's ready." Margaret's eyes lingered on the final page of the fund's ledger. The numbers were no longer her responsibility. Her fingers traced the corner of the paper, the ink settling into the fibers of the page like the last remnants of an old chapter. "So is pretending I was appreciated," she murmured, more to herself than to Victor. She could almost hear Victor's pause on the other end of the line, the brief hesitation before he responded. "I don't think anyone will question your decision, Margaret. Not when they see the impact it will have." Margaret closed her eyes, not to mourn but to embrace the silence that followed. She didn't need reassurances, and she certainly didn't need the empty words that had filled so many conversations before. The decision was hers, and it had been made with quiet conviction. "Thank you, Victor," she said, the words final, the closure they provided settling like dust on a shelf that had been long forgotten. Joanne arrived shortly afterward, the familiar jingle of her keys announcing her presence. She came bearing a stack of photos, the kind that always seemed to find their way into Margaret's life when things were shifting, when the world felt like it was tilting on its axis. Joanne sat down beside Margaret, sorting through the photos before handing them over with a smile. "A scholarship brunch," she said, her voice light, though her eyes carried the weight of the unspoken. "They invited me to one. The new recipient was there, beaming like she'd won a prize." Margaret picked up the first photo, her eyes scanning the image of a young woman in a simple but elegant dress, standing at the front of a crowd with a beaming smile, the weight of a future in her hands. "She looks happy," Margaret said, though the words felt heavier than they should have. She turned the photo over in her hands, tracing the edges with her fingers as she felt a shift within herself. "She should be," Joanne said softly. "She's earned it." Margaret didn't reply immediately. She placed the photo on the table and reached for the second one. A close-up of the same student, now sitting at the table with a group of others, holding a glass of lemonade, laughing as though she'd always been part of something greater. "Do you remember," Joanne asked after a moment, "when you first started the fund? How sure you were that it was going to make all the difference for Bethany?" Margaret looked at the photo, her eyes soft. I do. I thought she'd understand. I thought it would change things. Joanne didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She simply watched Margaret as she continued to examine the photos, the quietness of the moment telling its own story. Margaret took one of the pictures, holding it carefully in her hands, and walked over to her journal. She opened it to the next empty page, placed the photo gently inside, and taped it in place. Her name won't be in my will, Margaret said, almost absent-mindedly, as she pressed the tape down firmly. But she'll never be far from my thoughts. Joanne watched her carefully, her expression unreadable, but there was understanding there too. Margaret closed the journal with a soft, deliberate motion, the pages now heavier than they had ever been before. Do you know what I'm most proud of? Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Joanne didn't answer. She didn't need to. Margaret knew that she would understand, just as she always had. I'm proud of the fact that it's not about her anymore, Margaret said, her eyes distant as she looked out the window. It's about the ones who truly need help, the ones who can make something of it. Joanne nodded slowly, her gaze moving toward the photo Margaret had just taped into the journal. The right person, she said quietly. Later that day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat at her desk once more. The world outside her window was slowing down, the night settling over the town like a blanket. Her phone buzzed once again, this time with a letter from the new scholarship recipient. Margaret opened it slowly, reading the words carefully, her heart still. Dear Margaret, I cannot thank you enough for your belief in me. Your generosity has given me the chance to change my life. I will never forget this, and I will do my best to make you proud. Thank you for believing in someone like me. Margaret closed her eyes, the weight of the words sitting heavy in her chest, but this time, it wasn't a burden. It was something else entirely. Something like peace. She placed the letter inside her journal, beside the photo. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret allowed herself to exhale fully, feeling the weight of the past few months lift, piece by piece. Her legacy had changed, but it was hers now, and she could finally breathe. The voicemail icon blinked on Margaret's phone screen, a silent reminder of the world she had deliberately left behind. It was from Bethany. Margaret didn't need to listen to it. She could already hear the words in her mind. The pleading tone, the vague promises of change, the desperate attempt to reel her back in. She swiped the screen, her thumb quick and decisive. The voicemail disappeared, swallowed into the void of a world that no longer had any claim on her. She didn't save it. She didn't write it down. There was no point. Not anymore. Bethany had already shown her true colors. And Margaret wasn't in the business of collecting false hopes anymore. A few hours later, she found herself at Everwood Retirement Villas for the weekly Friday mixer. The community room was alive with laughter, soft jazz playing in the background, people talking in small circles as they sipped wine and nibbled on finger foods. It was a routine Margaret had grown accustomed to. She didn't always feel like being there, but tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the slight warmth in the air, or maybe it was the simple act of showing up. She accepted a glass of red wine from one of the volunteers and wandered over to a quiet corner of the room, a small group of familiar faces gathered around a table. Joanne was already there, chatting easily with a few of the other residents. Margaret's footsteps slowed as she approached, and for the first time in weeks, she felt something like laughter building in her chest. A joke, shared in the circle, caught her off guard, and the sound bubbled up from her belly, unexpected and freeing. It wasn't loud, but it was real. The kind of laughter that made everything else seem small, like the world could suddenly shrink and fit neatly into the space between her ribs. Joanne noticed first, her eyes lighting up as she saw the shift in Margaret. "That's the laugh I've been waiting for," she said softly, her voice carrying the hint of a long-held secret. Margaret smiled, the weight of the past few months finally lifting just a little. "It feels good," she said, her voice light. She felt lighter. Like she had dropped the heaviest stone from her chest. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she had allowed herself to simply laugh, without reservation. Not at Bethany's expense, not at her own sadness. Just because something in the moment made her feel good. Later that evening, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair, the soft evening light slipping through the blinds as her phone buzzed once again. She looked at the screen, and the familiar name of Susan appeared, the subject line reading, "Bethany's dropping out." Margaret sighed. She didn't need to open the email, but she did. The words, like so many others before them, were a desperate plea. A request for help, for intervention, for a way to clean up the mess that was Bethany's life. "She's dropping out. She needs help. Please, Margaret. We can't let her fail like this. I don't know what she'll do without your support. She's counting on you. Please help her." The words were familiar, too familiar. She read them once, then again. The anger didn't rise in her chest this time. It was something else. Something deeper, more resigned. She set the phone down slowly, turning her attention back to the soft glow of the room. Her fingers tapped the table beside her in rhythm, almost absent-mindedly, as the thought played in her mind like a song on repeat. She doesn't get it. She never will. Margaret opened her email app and began typing a response. The words were simple, cold even, but final. "That's a shame." She hit send without a second thought, the words closing the door on something that had been dragging her down for too long. A short while later, Joanne came in, a glass of lemonade in hand. "You good?" she asked, sitting down across from Margaret, watching her carefully. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She picked up her glass, her fingers lightly tracing the rim. The cold glass a small comfort in the warm evening air. "I gave her a map," Margaret said, her voice steady but resigned. She folded it into trash. Joanne's gaze softened, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Margaret didn't need to explain further. Joanne understood. She had seen it all. The way Margaret had tried to guide Bethany. The way she had invested so much of herself into the hope that it would make a difference. But hope, Margaret had learned, wasn't a currency that would buy anything in return. Her phone buzzed once again, breaking the silence. This time, it was a message from Thomas. She opened it without hesitation, her eyes scanning the words. "Moving trucks here, they're coming home." Margaret's chest tightened, the knot in her stomach familiar and cold. She set the phone down, but the words stayed with her, hanging in the air between her and Joanne. "Well," Margaret said softly, looking out the window at the fading light. "Guess I'll have to figure out what to do with all this space." Joanne didn't answer immediately. She simply raised her glass of lemonade and gave Margaret a small, quiet smile. It wasn't a smile of pity, but one of understanding, of shared experience. Margaret nodded to herself, the weight of the day settling into her bones. The future was always uncertain, but at least she knew one thing now. She wouldn't be carrying Bethany's future anymore. Not if it meant bending under the pressure of someone who refused to understand the value of anything given to her. The morning sun cast a soft golden hue across the living room, but Margaret didn't notice it. She was sitting at the desk again, the one by the window where she'd made so many decisions, the one that now felt strangely unimportant. There was nothing left to hold her here. Not in this space, not in this life she'd built for others. It had been too long, and she could feel the weight of it, the way the air had changed. It was time for a shift, a redefinition. The letter had been signed, the donation made, a matching gift, the kind that would create lasting change. The Ridgeway Opportunity Grant, with the matching funds, would provide full tuition for 2 students. Margaret didn't need to see the press release. She didn't need to know the names of those who would benefit from her generosity. They were not the ones who had never understood her. They were not the ones who had taken everything for granted. Still, she clicked on the link to the Ridgeway Foundation's website, the words "New Matching Gift" announced flashing at the top of the page. Her eyes skimmed over the words. Margaret Carter, anonymous donor, has generously provided full tuition for 2 deserving students from underserved backgrounds. She clicked open the comments section without hesitation, her finger already halfway through the motion before she even realized it. She had been prepared for the praise, for the gratitude. The words were always the same. What an amazing gift! You're making a difference in the world. It was the kind of validation she had never expected, but that felt good. There was something in the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done the right thing. But then, one comment stood out. It wasn't from a stranger, not from a grateful student or an anonymous well-wisher. It was from someone familiar, someone who couldn't be bothered to stay in the shadows. "We all know who this is really for," Bethany had posted. "Let's just hope they appreciate it more than I did." Margaret stared at the screen, the words glowing back at her in sharp relief. The bitterness, the jealousy. It was like a wound that had been reopened, one that had never quite healed. Bethany's words burned, but not in the way they used to. They didn't sting with regret or anger. No, this time they felt hollow. The kind of hollow that only comes when you know something is already dead. Her phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Susan. She had expected it, of course. Susan had always been quick to act when it came to matters of image, of reputation. The message was short, curt. "You've made your point. Now take it down. We can't have people thinking you're doing this to make up for what you've done to Bethany." Margaret's lips pressed together into a thin line. She didn't reply. There was no need. There was no negotiation here, no bargain to be struck. This was a done deal, and no one, not Susan, not Bethany, could undo it. Margaret closed the message, her mind still on Bethany's comment. She didn't even care that her granddaughter had seen the post, that she was seething somewhere, caught between pride and a bruised sense of entitlement. It didn't matter anymore. Bethany had always worn her life like an accessory, something to be flaunted, something to show off to the world. But Margaret had learned, over time, that people like Bethany would never truly appreciate anything unless it was wrapped in a bow, served on a silver platter. They didn't understand the price of things that couldn't be bought. She heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Thomas. The door creaked open and he stepped inside, his expression guarded, his silence saying more than any words could. He glanced at the screen for a moment before his eyes landed on Margaret. I saw the update," he said quietly. "The Ridgeway donation." Margaret nodded but didn't say anything. She didn't need to explain. The silence between them was enough. His eyes held a mixture of resignation and something else. Something too distant for her to name. She had learned to read him like this. Learned to understand that the absence of words between them was as heavy as anything spoken. "I don't know what you want me to say," he added after a long pause. "But you know this is just going to make things worse, don't you?" Margaret turned back to the screen, her gaze fixed on the page. "I don't need to make things right with her," she said softly. "Not anymore. I've made peace with what's been done. She won't understand that, but I've moved on." Thomas didn't answer. He just stood there, his silence doing the work. His silence had always been his answer, just like Susan's constant attempts to control. He didn't get it either. Later that afternoon, Margaret sat with Joanne on the porch, the cool breeze brushing past them as the world outside settled into quiet dusk. Joanne handed her a glass of lemonade, her voice thoughtful as she looked over at Margaret. "Bethany took your kindness and wore it like cheap perfume," Joanne said quietly, her eyes never leaving the horizon. Margaret didn't need to respond. She understood. The metaphor was a sharp one, but it was true. Bethany had always seen kindness as something to be used, something to wear for show. She had never understood the real value of it, the real cost of something freely given. But that was fine. Margaret had learned that some lessons weren't meant for everyone. She took a sip of her lemonade, letting the coldness fill her senses. The future was still uncertain, but in that moment Margaret felt the weight of what had been done, of what she had done, settle comfortably around her shoulders. No matter what Bethany or Susan said now, the work had been done. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt like she had finally found her own place in the world. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the soft morning light pouring through the window, illuminating the edges of the letter in front of her. It was heavy in her hands, the envelope a stark contrast to the delicate world she had worked so hard to cultivate. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, Bethany's looping, self-assured script. It felt like a breach, an invasion into the quiet space Margaret had created for herself. She opened the envelope slowly, as if the very act of unfolding it might break something. The letter inside was brief, no pleasantries, just sharp, defensive words, each one cutting deeper than the last. "I don't need your money, I never did. You made your point, and I've had enough." Margaret's fingers tightened on the paper, the words blurring slightly as her eyes lingered on them. No apologies, no recognition of what had been done for her. Just bitterness. It stung, but only because it confirmed what she had known all along. Bethany would never understand. The letter continued in that same harsh, defensive tone. "This whole thing was never about me. It was about you feeling good about yourself. You can keep your money, your legacy. I don't need any of it." Margaret's heart didn't race. It didn't clench. It simply stopped for a moment, as if the words were a shadow she had seen coming for a long time. The coldness of it settled in, and she took a slow breath. She sat back in her chair, staring at the letter, seeing every word as a reflection of the years of effort she had put into trying to make things right, trying to repair something that was never meant to be fixed. She'd been chasing an illusion, clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, Bethany would see the value in all that had been given to her. But it was gone. The hope, the connection, gone, like dust in the wind. Margaret placed the letter on the table in front of her and reached for the shredder. The hum of the machine filled the room as she slid the letter inside, the sharp sound of the blades cutting through the paper filling the silence. She watched it disappear, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but strips of paper and the quiet satisfaction of finality. Joanne stood in the doorway, watching quietly. She had been there for every moment, every shift in Margaret's life, and she had witnessed the unraveling of this relationship from the start. She stepped forward, her gaze soft but steady, and sat down across from Margaret. "You okay?" Joanne asked, her voice low but full of understanding. Margaret didn't answer right away. She took a moment, her eyes still focused on the shredder, which continued its work. It was as if the machine were doing for her what she could no longer do for herself, cutting away the remnants of a dream that had long since turned to dust. "I just stopped mistaking closeness for connection," Margaret said quietly, her voice calm, almost distant. "I thought I could fix it. I thought I could give her something to make her see, but she never wanted to understand." Joanne nodded, the weight of Margaret's words settling into the space between them. There was nothing left to explain, nothing to defend. This wasn't about Bethany's understanding anymore. It was about Margaret finding peace with what had already been given, and what had already been lost. The shredder clicked off, the final remnants of the letter falling into the bin. Margaret sat back in her chair, her hands still resting on the table. The silence between them was no longer heavy, it was something else. Something like release. Joanne reached over, offering Margaret the coffee she had brought with her, the warmth of the cup a small comfort in the cool morning. Margaret accepted it, her fingers wrapping around the ceramic, the warmth spreading through her hands. For a moment they simply sat there, the hum of the morning outside the window the only sound. The world had continued on, just as it always had. And yet, for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt like she could breathe again. The door to the past had closed. There would be no more letters, no more calls, no more demands for something she could never give. And in that silence, in the absence of everything that had weighed her down, Margaret found the smallest of smiles pulling at the corners of her lips. Margaret stood at the edge of the ballroom, her hands lightly resting at her sides. The navy silk of her dress draped elegantly over her frame, the fabric catching the soft glow of the overhead chandeliers. She wasn't one for flash, for grand gestures, but tonight, the quiet grace she wore was deliberate. It wasn't just the dress, it wasn't just the evening, it was the culmination of everything that had shifted inside her. Everything she had let go. She had been invited, of course, as the anonymous donor behind the Ridgeway opportunist. Grant. It was an elegant affair, with people milling around in tuxedos and gowns, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. But Margaret had never been interested in the crowd, never been interested in the grandiosity of the event. She wasn't there for the attention. She wasn't even there for the recognition. She was there because she had earned this moment. Not in the way that Bethany might have expected, but in the only way that truly mattered, by doing something that would outlast her, something that would make a difference. Victor approached her with a glass of wine, his movements as smooth and precise as ever. He smiled slightly, his eyes gleaming with that rare flicker of respect he reserved only for moments like these. "To your legacy, Margaret," he said, raising his glass to her. "A legacy that has already begun to change lives." Margaret accepted the glass with a nod, but her eyes stayed focused on the crowd, her mind distant. She wasn't thinking about the applause or the speeches that were to come. She wasn't thinking about the donors or the media coverage. She was thinking about the student speakers, the ones whose names she didn't even know yet, but whose lives she had already impacted. The speeches began shortly thereafter, the words echoing through the room. Margaret's attention wavered, the excitement of the evening fading into the background. She was used to this, the glitzy lights, the pomp, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. She had no need for accolades. Then, the student speaker stepped up to the microphone, a young woman whose name Margaret didn't catch, but whose eyes gleamed with gratitude as she looked out over the room. "Tonight, I stand here not just as a scholarship recipient," the student began, her voice trembling slightly, "but as someone whose life has been changed because someone believed in me. There's a donor here tonight, and I don't know who they are, but their generosity, their trust, has shown me what it truly means to have someone believe in your future." The room fell silent, the student's words settling over the crowd like a soft embrace. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, the weight of the moment heavier than she expected. She could see the faces of the other recipients, eyes wide with hope, with belief in a future they had once thought unattainable. The student paused, then continued, her voice steady now. "To the donor who showed us what trust looks like, we are forever grateful." A swell of applause followed, rising through the room in a wave. Margaret's hands tightened around the glass of wine, but her lips curved upward in something like a smile. It wasn't an overt expression of joy. It wasn't a tear-streaked moment. It was something quieter, more meaningful. The applause, the recognition, It was all secondary. It had never been about that. But now, in this small, almost imperceptible moment, it was clear. Her work was done. The right people had received what they needed. Victor raised his glass again, his voice low, but his words sharp with admiration. Your legacy, Margaret, is already taking root. The impact is real. Margaret took a sip from her own glass, allowing the warmth of the wine to settle in her chest. It's done, she replied, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. Joanne arrived just then, slipping into the space beside Margaret with her usual quiet grace. She had been watching the proceedings from a distance, but now her eyes met Margaret's with a knowing glance. Still feel like soup? Joanne asked softly, her words carrying a gentle teasing edge. Margaret's smile deepened, but it wasn't filled with the humor of the question. No, this was something else. It was a smile of certainty, of hard-won peace. No, Margaret said, her voice clear and calm. I feel like steel. Joanne didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply raised her glass, the soft clink of crystal a quiet punctuation to the moment. Margaret's words hung between them, but there was no need to say more. They both knew what it meant. Steel wasn't just strength. It was the resilience born from everything Margaret had weathered, everything she had let go. The rust, the corrosion, all of it had been cleaned away. And what remained was something that could withstand anything. The evening progressed, speeches came and went, and Margaret took in each moment with a sense of detachment, yet fulfillment. The applause for her name would fade, as it always did, but the impact, the real impact, would continue. At the end of the night, as the crowd began to disperse, a plaque was presented to Margaret. It wasn't a huge spectacle. No grandstanding, no cameras flashing, just a small gesture from the Ridgway Foundation, an acknowledgement of her work and her legacy. The plaque was simple, etched with her name, Margaret Carter Legacy Award. The letters were clean, polished, just like the person who had earned it. She accepted it quietly, a small nod of appreciation. The world outside had not changed, but Margaret had. The night ended as quietly as it had begun. Margaret and Joanne walked out into the crisp night air, the sounds of the crowd slowly dying behind them. Margaret felt a sense of calm in the cool breeze, the soft rustle of the trees in the distance. For the first time in a long time, Margaret wasn't searching for anything anymore. The future, whatever it held, would come. But she had already built something that would endure. And for her, that was enough. The phone buzzed again, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet stillness of Margaret's living room. She knew who it was before she even glanced at the screen. Bethany. She had called and left a message, of course. Margaret didn't need to hear it. The tone would be familiar, the desperation, the soft promises that would slip through her like water. The words that tried to reignite something that had been long extinguished. Margaret didn't rush to pick up the phone. Instead, she let it ring until the voicemail icon blinked in, a silent reminder of the past she had already closed the door on. She wasn't surprised. Bethany's attempts to reach out had been coming more frequently now, each one more desperate than the last. A call, a text, a message posted online. Each communication was a subtle plea, a string of words wrapped in a mix of guilt and hope, the same empty cycle she had grown too tired to follow. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming softly against the edge of the table, the rhythm slow, methodical. For a moment, she just sat there, letting the silence fill the room. The truth was, she didn't need to hear Bethany's voice. She had already heard it too many times before. She knew what would be said, and she knew what it meant. There was nothing new to be learned from any of it. She didn't listen to the voicemail. She didn't even save it. Instead, Margaret opened her laptop, her fingers moving effortlessly across the keyboard. She began typing, the words coming easily now, without the hesitation that had once plagued her. She wrote a letter, short and kind but clear. Bethany, I will always care. I will no longer carry. She stared at the words for a moment, feeling the weight of them settle in. It was a small thing, a letter that said everything that needed to be said, without guilt, without explanation. She clicked send, and with that, the last bit of the past faded away. There was no need for a phone call. There was no need for more back and forth. No more hoping that something could be fixed. Bethany's life was no longer hers to carry. Later that day, Joanne arrived at Margaret's apartment, as she had so many times before. This time, there was something lighter about Margaret. She wasn't carrying the weight of uncertainty anymore. The phone call, the letter, it was all over. Joanne took a seat at the table, studying Margaret with quiet intensity, as she always did. You okay? Joanne asked, her voice low but filled with a quiet understanding. Margaret smiled, a small, genuine smile. I'm better than okay, she said, her voice steady. I'm done with dragging things out. Joanne nodded, her eyes soft with a knowing that needed no words. She understood what Margaret meant. They had been through enough of this, both of them, and now Margaret had let go of what had been holding her back. Closure isn't owed, Joanne said, her tone thoughtful. It's chosen. Margaret's gaze shifted from the window to her friend. And I spent enough on people who chose not to grow, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the conviction behind it was sharp, firm. She had learned the lesson long ago. There were some things, some people, that weren't worth the weight of her investment. Joanne smiled softly, her lips curving in understanding. You've done enough. Now, it's time to let it be. Margaret stood and walked over to her bookshelf, where a photo album sat, its edges worn from years of turning. She opened it to a page that had never quite felt finished. A picture of her with the Ridgway Scholarship recipients, their faces bright with promise, their futures unfolding before them. They were the ones who mattered now, the ones whose potential was not wasted, whose futures were shaped by real choices. She slipped the photo out of the album, holding it in her hands for a moment, then gently placed it in her journal. The pages of the book closed with a soft finality, the image now a part of the story Margaret had written for herself. Joanne watched quietly as Margaret tucked the photo away, the gesture so simple, yet so symbolic. There were no more half-finished chapters, no more unspoken words. Margaret turned back to her friend, a small laugh escaping her lips, as though the weight of everything had suddenly lifted. Now, I feel like I've earned my place in the world, she said, almost to herself. Joanne chuckled softly, raising her coffee cup in a silent toast to that realization. You always have. That evening, Margaret sat outside on her porch, the air cool and calm as the sun dipped below the horizon. The house was quiet, but there was no emptiness. There was a peace in the stillness now, the kind that comes from finally letting go. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes soft with the knowledge that the chapter had closed. The future was still unfolding, but it wasn't defined by others. It was hers now, shaped by her choices, by her strength. And for the first time in years, she felt certain. She felt whole. The cafe was warm, the hum of conversation mixing with the soft clink of cups and the occasional steam of espresso machines. Margaret sat at a small corner table, the window beside her framing the world outside. Bright, bustling, and full of possibilities. She had arrived early, as she always did, but today it was different. Today, she wasn't waiting for an event to unfold, or for someone to arrive to talk about what had been done. She was waiting for the moment when her decision, her legacy, would feel real in a way that didn't involve awards, plaques, or recognition. Rosa arrived just as Margaret had finished taking a sip from her coffee. She was younger than Margaret had expected, a little shy, but her smile was immediate and genuine. Rosa wasn't a scholarship recipient in the way Margaret had imagined them. Eager, nervous, too full of gratitude. Rosa was solid, grounded in herself, her movements purposeful as she slid into the chair across from Margaret. "Hi," Rosa said, her voice a bit tentative but warm. "Thank you for meeting me." Margaret smiled, motioning to the coffee in front of her. "It's my pleasure." They sat for a few moments in comfortable silence. Margaret studied Rosa, noticing the way she looked out the window as if absorbing every detail, every little flicker of life that passed by. There was an ease to her, an air of someone who was finally in the right place, the right moment, and Margaret couldn't help but admire it. Finally, Rosa looked back at Margaret, her eyes bright, almost shy. "I've never really known how to thank you," she began, her voice softer now, but with conviction underneath. "I mean, the money was one thing, but you gave me more than just funding. You gave me permission to dream out loud." Margaret's heart warmed at the words. But there was something more personal, more profound. She hadn't thought about it that way. She hadn't realized that the act of giving had freed someone else's voice, their sense of possibility. It wasn't about Bethany or her own unfulfilled expectations. It was about this, the simple act of making space for someone else to find their path. "I didn't give you anything," Margaret said quietly, her tone soft but firm. "You did the work. You just needed someone to believe in you." Rosa's smile deepened. "Maybe," she said. "But I wouldn't have believed it was possible without that. You showed me it could be." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. They were talking in circles, but it was a beautiful kind of circle, one where Margaret didn't need to be the teacher or the guide. Rosa was speaking for herself now, carving out a future that wasn't defined by anyone's expectations but her own. The conversation shifted, as it always does, to books, to family, to the small moments that shape someone's life. They discussed the latest novels they had read, how Margaret still preferred paperbacks, even in the digital age, how Rosa had grown up in foster care but had never let it define her. They spoke of boundaries, how family could be chosen, how the people who loved you weren't always the ones who shared your blood. Margaret listened intently, her heart growing fuller with each passing minute. Rosa was everything Bethany could have been if she had just allowed herself to grow, to understand. At one point, after a long pause, Rosa shifted in her seat, her hands folding together, her voice quieter. "What do I owe you?" Margaret looked at her, the question settling into the space between them like an old echo. She had spent so much of her life giving to the wrong people, giving in hope, giving with expectation. But this moment was different. This was not about obligation. It was about a future being handed over, not from one person to another, but as a shared responsibility. "You owe me nothing," Margaret replied, her voice steady but gentle. "Just pass it forward." Rosa's eyes shone, and she leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "I will," she said. "I'll make sure I do." The conversation slowed, winding down, and after a few moments of quiet, Margaret felt the urge to speak, to say something that had been simmering inside her. She didn't know if it was for Rosa's sake or her own, but it felt necessary. "You know," Margaret said, looking directly at Rosa, "I think you're going to do more than just pass it forward. You'll change lives, just by being who you are." Rosa looked at Margaret, a hint of a question in her eyes, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. The understanding passed between them, an unspoken promise of something greater than either of them had realized. As they stood to leave, Rosa hugged Margaret. It wasn't a performative gesture, the kind people sometimes offer when they're obliged. It was real, genuine, and it felt like a connection that had nothing to do with obligation or reward. "Thank you," Rosa whispered, the words full of weight, and yet so light. Margaret returned the hug, holding on a moment longer than necessary, feeling the warmth of the younger woman's sincerity. As Rosa walked out of the cafe, Margaret lingered by the door for a moment, watching her disappear into the bustling street outside. She felt something shift inside her, something deep and unnameable. It wasn't about what had been given, but what was now in motion, something that would carry forward without her needing to hold it together. Joanne arrived just as Margaret turned away from the window, a soft smile on her lips. "How was it?" Joanne asked, already knowing the answer. Margaret's smile was serene, a quiet sense of peace surrounding her. "It was perfect." Joanne raised an eyebrow, her lips curving upward. "You raised the right daughter. She just didn't share your blood," she said, her voice gentle. Margaret met her eyes, the words hanging between them like a secret they had always known. It didn't matter that Rosa wasn't her biological daughter. What mattered was that, in this moment, Margaret had created something real, something that would last. Margaret stood in the dimly lit corner of her room, the dress draped across her hands. It had been hanging in her closet for months now, untouched, forgotten, yet still there. A relic of a past she had tried to leave behind. The fabric was worn in places, the hem frayed, but it still carried the memory of that afternoon at Franklin Street Bistro, when everything had started to unravel. It wasn't the stain of soup that had made it significant, but the weight of what it symbolized. That dress had seen more than just a lunch. It had witnessed the last shreds of a relationship that had been bled dry, piece by piece. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as she carefully folded the dress, the once crisp fabric now soft and pliable in her hands. It wasn't the kind of dress one would wear again. Not after what had happened, not after all the hope and love that had been poured into it, only for it to be mocked, laughed at, dismissed. She couldn't wear it again. But throwing it away felt like another form of surrender, as though it would be one more thing she would leave behind without fully acknowledging its significance. So instead she placed it in a donation box, her hands slow, deliberate. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. There was no grand moment of catharsis, no finality that would undo the past. It was simply the right thing to do. As she secured the lid of the box, Margaret attached a small handwritten tag to the outside. "Worn through war, stitched with resolve." She stepped back, looking at the box for a long moment. The words weren't just for the dress. They were for everything she had been through, for everything she had given. There was a certain kind of strength in that phrase, a quiet defiance against what had been taken from her, against what had never been appreciated. She had survived it. She had made it through. And now, it was time to let go. Margaret took the box in her arms, carrying it down the hallway, her steps slow but sure. The weight of it didn't bother her. It was light, almost like nothing at all. She was no longer weighed down by the past. Her future, whatever it was, had already been reshaped. As she walked past the community drop station at Everwood, she noticed the soft light of the late afternoon spilling across the pavement. The sounds of the neighborhood, the rustling of trees, the distant hum of traffic, felt distant, like they were part of someone else's life. Her own life, the one that had been tangled in expectations and disappointments, was unraveling, thread by thread. And it was freeing. On her way back from the drop station, she passed Ava, who had just returned from a weekend trip home. Ava's face lit up when she saw Margaret, her beaming smile cutting through the quiet moment like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Grandma!" Ava exclaimed, her voice warm with affection. "I got into the teaching program. I'm going to be a teacher. Margaret felt a shift in her chest, a soft, almost imperceptible weight lifting as she looked at Ava, standing there, proud and confident. The news was unexpected, but not in the way it once would have been. Ava had always been the one to show up, the one who sought to understand, to make something of the opportunities in front of her. Well, Margaret said, her voice steady but rich with meaning, I guess it wasn't all a loss. Ava's eyes softened at her words, the light in her face still there, but now mixed with something else. Understanding. You've always believed in me, Grandma. I couldn't have done it without you. Margaret simply nodded, the weight of her granddaughter's words washing over her like a gentle tide. This was what mattered. This was what had made it all worth it. The past, the mistakes, the hurt, none of it had been in vain. Ava was the real legacy, the one who would carry it forward, not just for Margaret, but for herself. Margaret stood there for a moment, watching as Ava bounced on the balls of her feet, her excitement palpable. She could see the future now, not as some uncertain blur, but as something vivid, something alive. Ava's success wasn't just her own, it was a shared victory, one that Margaret had shaped, quietly, with every choice she had made. As Ava moved to step inside, Margaret took one last look at the box she had just dropped off. It was done. The dress, the symbol of a life she had hoped for but never quite got, was now just a thing to be passed along. And with that, so was her connection to it. Ava's voice carried back to her as she stepped inside. You're coming to the ceremony, right, Grandma? Margaret smiled to herself, watching the world turn, the sounds of the neighborhood returning. Of course I'll be there, she called back, her voice steady, her heart lighter than it had been in a long time. Margaret took one last glance at the house, then stepped inside. The door clicked shut softly behind her, and she closed the chapter with a finality that no one else could take from her. My granddaughter spilled soup on my dress and laughed. Her college fund stopped laughing too.